Okay, so yes, I'm going to be talking about seed production and processing, and we've touched on some of these concepts already, which has been great, especially in the grower panel from the Northwest folks this morning. It's been super interesting to learn what challenges are the same and different in different regions. And so I'll be talking about sort of the process that we have here, that we have going on here in the Southwest. And firstly, I just want to briefly go over sort of our version of the native plant materials development cycle. Patricia also showed a slide yesterday with the similar process, and I'll just highlight a few nuances here. And so, like Ashley just went over, the first big step of kicking off the whole cycle is the wild seed collection, and we call that Generation Zero seed, or G0. After it's been collected, it comes back to our seed lab to get cleaned and processed and stored. And then from there, it can take a few different avenues. Some of the seed, about 20%, is used for research because there's still a lot that everyone is wanting to know about how to grow this type of native plant material that's locally sourced and genetically diverse. And there's also a lot of questions still about how to grow novel species that haven't been in commercial production before. And then a smaller portion, about 15% of the seed that's collected through the partnership, is put into long-term storage for seed banking. And then the majority, about 65%, is used to start seed production fields. And so that's why I'm talking about seed production. At this point, the seed that comes off of production fields, when it's harvested, it's called Generation 1 or G1 seed. And at that point, it goes through a similar process as wild seed because it needs to get cleaned and processed. And that's when it really goes sort of full circle and becomes available to the partners for their use in restoration or research projects. So this step of the cycle is all about increasing the quantity of seed that becomes available, because wild collecting seed doesn't amount to sort of the huge demand that there is currently for locally sourced seed. And just a reminder, that's the goal of our partnership and a lot of other seed partnership, is to increase that availability of ecologically appropriate plant materials. And so how we're doing this is first working with our partners to find funding mechanisms and identify species that they want to use in restoration projects. And then next, our office contracts with local farmers to grow out those species in increased fields. Right now, the way that our model is set up is that in the duration of the contract, all the seed that is harvested from the field gets cleaned and then returned to the partner that funded the production. And Melanie mentioned this too, but that's a little bit different than the way other seed partnerships are set up. Eventually, we'd like to move away from just the sole contract model and get to a point where there's more farmers who are growing this type of plant material on their own on speculation, and that they're confident that once it becomes available, there'll be folks to buy it. There are a lot of benefits that come to both the farmers and to the partnership by collaborating on native seed production. And some of the benefits to farmers include that they can diversify their income from other agricultural crops that they've been previously growing, or supplement to them. And doing this, producing this type of seed on contract, reduces their risk a little bit. There's also benefits to farmers because once native plants are established, there are usually fewer water and fertilizer inputs, and so it can have some cost savings there too compared to other crops. There's a lot of on-farm conservation benefits of growing natives. Those include attracting pollinators and beneficial insects to the farm. Perennial crops also build soil and reduce erosion. And so all of these type of agricultural practices are better suited to combat climate change, which we talked about a little bit earlier today. The benefits to the partnership is, the first big one is that seed becomes available to partners that are interested in using locally sourced seed for their projects. And a side bonus is always that every time we grow a new species or work with a new farmer, we learn a lot about producing that species, and it all goes toward the goal of making seed more generally available for folks to use and to purchase. Here's a quick look at the farms and the species that we're currently growing out through the partnership. And you can see the list of farmers and the species that they're growing here on the slide. So in 2021, we were working with 5 farmers. 3 were growing seed for New Mexico and 2 for Arizona. They were growing 15 species altogether from 4 seed zones on about 7.5 acres. And we learned so much from every field that we grow and every species that we've worked with so far. And part of our strategic plan is sharing those lessons learned with our stakeholders. I'm going to talk about the different scales of growers that we're currently working with and why we value each of them. And so we work with some large growers like the folks at Bamert here who are currently growing 6 different species for the partnership. And we've learned a lot from large seed producers, and you'll have a chance to as well in the grower panel that's coming up pretty soon. Large-scale seed producers have the capacity and the infrastructure to harvest a lot of seed, which just means more seed getting to our partners or onto the market, which is awesome and really the reason for this whole partnership. Some of the challenges include that large producers might be located further away from your source seed or from you, which can present logistical challenges. And this was touched on earlier, but there's still some research questions about how growing seed in a further location from their source can affect the genetics of the generation 1 or generation 2 seed coming from those fields. Another challenge is that it can take a long time especially for small seed partnerships, to collect enough source seed to start a field with a large grower. Since depending on your capacity for collection, even a few pounds of seed can be difficult depending on the species or depending on the seed zone that you're restricted to. And in the grower panel this afternoon, you'll also hear from growers, as we did this morning, about the challenges that also exist for them to grow out this type of plant material that's really diverse and locally sourced. So that's really interesting to hear about. We're also working with a lot of medium to small scale growers on initial increase fields. And there are a lot of benefits to this scale of production. And it can also be a stepwise process. As in, you can collect just a small bit of source seed from the wild and do an initial increase field with a small grower in order to get to the amount of pounds that you need to hand it over to a larger producer. So these small fields can be anywhere from 1/10 of an acre, 1/4 acre, 1/2 acre. And it's a really great way to learn about novel species that haven't been commercially produced, or species that there's just not that much information about producing them. And even for these fields, when the goal is really, increasing the amount of seed, we always learn a ton of bonus research from this type of field. So an example of this can be figuring out the timing of flood irrigation to allow directly sown seeds to germinate, since in the Southwest, a lot of farmers, that's their only method for irrigating. Another example of bonus research is sort of what type of weed management techniques work the best for a certain farmer, depending on his equipment and capacity. And so one goal for the coming years, and part of our strategic plan, is to get more equipment that could be shared among smaller growers to increase their capacity and make their lives a little easier. Because that's really one of the biggest challenges that we hear from small growers, is just the amount of manual labor that it takes to manage even a small seed field. Especially when it comes to seed harvesting by hand, which the growers in the Northwest panel talked about too. So overall, what we've learned is that, at least for our partnership, we need a diversity of growers to be able to fulfill the diversity of needs from our partners. And so, we can leverage different partner funding amounts and different end user needs. Some partners might need just a whole bunch of one species of plant for one specific project. Other partners might want 20 different species, but they only need 1 pound of each for a research project. And so we really been able to leverage this diversity of growers. And here's a map of where all of our growers are currently located. Here's just some pretty pictures of all the grasses that we have in either former or current production in the partnership. And here's all the forbs. And we are growing almost as many forbs as grasses, I think, at this point. And we are prioritizing forbs since we hear from our partners all the time about how they are interested in a higher amount of diversity of forbs available for restoration. I also didn't want to leave out the role that nursery producers play in our native plant materials cycle. So I'm just going to talk briefly about that now, since really the majority of our fields at this point have been established by growing plugs in the greenhouse with a nursery producer and then outplanting them into the seed field. There's a few reasons why we do this. So benefits are that it takes a lot less source seed to start a new field. And Ashley just sort of outlined how complex it is to really get the source seed that we're using for this process. And so, you know, for plug planting, you really only need a few seeds per plug, as long as the viability is okay, in order to plant out a field, compared to the amount of the seeding rate that you might want to use to get good establishment by direct sowing. It's also a great way to get consistent field establishment, because you can plant a plant every foot, and as long as they're happy and get established, you'll know that you'll have a pretty consistent field, which is really important for managing weeds and for harvesting. Plants also have a head start on their first year if they're transplanted, and we've also heard from some growers that it can reduce their weed management compared to direct sowing techniques. Some of the challenges include that it's really manually intensive to do this by hand, and Jesse talked about this yesterday as well. But even doing this for a quarter acre or a half acre field, we get like a big group of folks together to help, volunteers, and it can still take days really, and it's just really difficult. And so scaling this up without equipment is not very feasible for most groups, at least. And there's also some challenges around potentially incompatible soil types with the nursery medium compared to the soil type that you're outplanting into. And there's also additional costs to the partners for nursery production. It was really great to hear that so many nursery producers were able to join the conference, because we rely a lot on their expertise and their knowledge about propagating native species and local sources that are sometimes really tricky to break dormancy or to make them stay happy inside a greenhouse. And so we really appreciate all their work in this field. Okay. I think I have a couple more minutes. Yeah. So I'm just going to briefly go over the two areas in which we've built up our capacity in the last 2 years, which is in seed processing and seed storage. And Melanie mentioned this too. But in 2020, we hired a full-time plant materials technician to clean and process and manage all of our wild collections and sometimes production field harvest. And this has allowed us to stay mostly on top of our sort of annual seed cleaning responsibilities. And acquiring a lab space, which is shown here, and a few pieces of seed cleaning equipment has really been crucial in order to make this happen as well. And another exciting development was that in January of 2021, we finished the construction of a walk-in seed cooler to store our wild collected and production field harvest for sort of short to medium term storage, which is super important for extending their viability, because if they're kept cold and dry, most species will stay viable for a lot longer than they would in ambient conditions. So this was really exciting, and we're grateful to the New Mexico BLM for the funding for this project, and the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish for loaning us the space for the cooler. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you. And do we have time for questions?
Yes, thanks, Maria. We do have time for questions.
Okay.
And a few have come in. So to start, here's someone saying, I'm excited to learn that you're able to pay farmers a commercial rate to produce native plant seed that you can actually sell at remunerative prices. I presume you have some species that generate a loss, but some others that are much more profitable. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I also don't know what I don't even know what that is, but I think I get the gist. Um, yeah, so we use grant and agreement funding to pay our native plant producers. And it depends on their scale and their sort of their capacity on what it makes sense for them, what it's feasible for them to do this type of work for. So larger producers can produce seed for a little bit less than it would take for a small producer to make it worth their while and all their work to produce our seed. And so right now, with the way our contracts are set up, we're not selling seed based on the amount that farmers are producing, if that makes sense. And I'm happy to send some more information along to you, Robert, if you have additional questions about that.
Great. And there were a couple questions about weed management. So here's one. Do all of your fields use weed cloths? Or if not, what is the weed management strategy?
Yeah, not all of our fields use weed cloth. Some farmers, especially on a smaller scale, have really liked it, and there's definitely benefits and downfalls depending on your setup. Weed management strategies just include hoeing, really, especially on a small scale, just hand weeding, or cultivating in between the rows with different types of equipment. Some of our growers use herbicides. It just really depends on sort of their scale and the setup that they have for irrigating and all kinds of things.
Makes sense. All right, and can you talk about the types of seed cleaning equipment you've invested in?
Yes, I think Taylor's on here too. If I could find him, I'd ask him to answer. But we have three pieces of sort of mechanical equipment that we invested in to sort of start off the seed cleaning process. One is a brush machine, which sort of breaks apart the seed from other things that are attached to a seed, like other chaff and petals, etc. And then we have a clipper, which sort of separates seed by size. And we have an air separator, which separates seeds by weight. And those three do a pretty good job. And then there's some species that just, with the equipment that we have, nothing does it. And we have hand cleaning screens and sieves that we use as well.
Great. I'm going to lump a couple questions about the cooler. So people are asking, what temperature is the cooler, and does it also regulate humidity, and is it designed for seed storage specifically?
Yes, great question. I love talking about the cooler. Yeah, we have it kept about 38 degrees. It ranges a little bit, but above freezing, but below 40. And it does, we a big part of the purchase price was really getting a dehumidifier because just a normal fridge can have super high humidity, like 60, 70, 80%. And so the dehumidifier keeps it about 25% relative humidity. So that's super important in terms of keeping it dry. And it was designed to just keep seeds because we got the dehumidifier and we have the sensors in there that keep the conditions right for seed specifically.
Great. We have, there's only, oh, actually, I think we're out of time for questions. I'm so sorry.
No
Thank
worries.
you so much. And thanks for all of the questions.
Thank you, Ashley. All right, let me stop here.